Great, thank you, Kristen. Just as a note, we have begun recording this session, so please make sure to keep your microphones muted and your videos off unless you are speaking. So to introduce our first speaker for session 3, we'll have session 3 is entitled Seaweed Regulations and State Perspectives, and our first talk will be by Wade Carden, and he'll be providing an overview of the current and potential future regulatory environment around seaweed and how commercial seaweed cultivation is being viewed around the Sound, and furthermore with connections with bioextraction. Wade is a biologist with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He's the unit leader for the Shellfish Management Unit in the Division of Marine Resources, and his responsibilities include conservation regulation of the state's shellfish resources, including permitting programs for commercial harvest of wild shellfish stocks, shellfish cultivation, and restoration activities. His unit also permits and regulates cultivation of all marine plant and animal life undertaken in New York's Marine and Coastal District. That's a lot.
Thanks again for the introduction, Jordan. So yeah, I'll give you the New York perspective on seaweed cultivation. And as you'll find when you hear from Anoushka a little later on in the session, New York is not nearly as far along with seaweed cultivation as Connecticut. But just to orient those who may not be familiar with the Department of Environmental Conservation and Division of Marine Resources in New York, we have overall management authority for the conservation and protection of marine resources and their habitats within the state's Marine and Coastal District. And we're charged with the management of the state's important commercial recreational fisheries. We have regulatory and permitting programs for wild harvest fisheries, as well as all types of marine aquaculture, including shellfish and seaweed aquaculture. And our division is separated into 4 bureaus. That would be marine habitat, interstate fisheries management, marine fisheries, and shell fisheries. And within the Shell Fisheries Bureau, we have harvest area classification. So keeping those areas that don't meet national standards for shellfish harvest closed. We have the laboratory that is involved in that classification program, inspection of shellfish shippers, shipping product into intra and interstate commerce, and then management, which is where I come in, and where also any of the management of aquaculture is found. So real quickly, just to cite the permitting authority for mariculture in New York, to do cultivation of marine species in New York, you do need a permit from our agency. Here's some citations both in the state's environmental conservation law as well as regulations. Just to quickly go over some definitions that can be confusing at times. On bottom culture of shellfish is shellfish freely broadcasted right out onto the bottom in contact with the sediment, whereas off bottom culture is any containment of shellfish, which is largely the kind of shellfish culture industry we have in New York. Very little on bottom culture. So off in this context, people often think that means floating gear. In this case, it means any kind of contained shellfish. So in New York, mariculture presently is really shellfish culture, and taking it a step further, it's really just oyster culture. And just to cite some 2019 stats, since that's would be our last year that wouldn't have been impacted by COVID, we had 79 commercial shellfish culture permits issued, and for that year, 6 of those were new growers. So among those 79 permits or growers, 51 are reporting production, so approximately 65%. And we only have one of those growers that's actually reporting culture of another species, and that would be hard clams, and doing so by another method being on bottom. So that's an annual production of about 6 million oysters and a dockside value of 2.4 million. So we have a few mariculture access programs in New York. I want to point out that obtaining permits from DEC is not the same as gaining access to underwater lands. Your access to underwater land to cultivate marine species is something that becomes a prerequisite for you getting the permit from DEC. So I'll go through the four major programs we have in the state that there's three scenarios associated with. I'll start out at the state level, then down to the county level and the town level. Long Island consists of two counties, Nassau in the west, Suffolk in the east, and there are Long Island towns which in many cases hold jurisdiction or ownership on the underwater lands, the inland bays within their boundaries. So first scenario, state underwater lands, we'll say as an example, Long Island Sound, Block Island Sound. The environmental conservation law does give DEC the authority to lease for shellfish cultivation. A formal leasing program has never been established, but we do have what's called a temporary marine area use assignment program. I'll talk about this program a little more in detail in the next slide. Next, we have a situation where the state-owned underwater lands of Peconic and Gardner's Bays on the east end of Long Island were ceded over to Suffolk County back in 1969 for creation of a leasing program. And then we have the town-owned underwater land situation I mentioned, where we have two towns, Islip and Brookhaven, who both have established licensing or leasing programs within their bays. So going back to state-owned underwater lands, the temporary assignment program was really created as an interim program for Peconic and Gardner's Bays, because it was not until 2009 that Suffolk County actually established their program. So 30 years after the law that actually ceded control of those underwater lands to the county was enacted. So you see these tiny green dots that have been highlighted by these red circles. That's not the size of the area. That's just to point those out. You can see there's not very many of them here in the image, and there's none anymore in the area of Peconic and Gardner's Bays. And that, of course, is because now there is a leasing program there. Prior to the leasing program, there were approximately 30 of these assignments in Peconic and Gardner's Bays. So these temporary assignments are limited to off-bottom shellfish culture only, and they're not predefined sites. We work individually with each applicant that's interested in establishing one of these assignments in the Sound. I think just because of the nature of Long Island Sound and it not being as favorable of a location as some of the inland bays, we don't issue very much of these, as you can see by the limited number of dots there. Now on to Suffolk County's aquaculture lease program. This program consists of both 10-acre leases, which you can see with the small squares in this image, and there's also some larger oyster grants, which are privately owned bottom that go back to the time of leasing of much larger tracts of underwater land. Some of those also have Suffolk County leases associated with them. This program was established again in 2009 and has just passed its 10-year milestone just a couple of years ago, and has conducted a review of the program. And as many on this in today's program, I'm sure, are aware, the state law concerning ceding of the underwater lands over to Suffolk for shellfish cultivation was amended to include seaweed. The town of Islip's Bay Bottom licensing program, small program, started out around 2010, consists of about 120 acres off of Captree Island in Great South Bay, and consists of about 18 growers, all farming, using mostly floating gear in this shallow area. However, the town of Islip is in the process of expanding their program. They have this phase 3 expansion throughout a large area of Great South Bay, south of Heckscher State Park, on the more to the northern side of the bay here. And the town is interested in giving that opportunity to cultivate seaweed as well as shellfish. And then finally, the other town program, Town of Brookhaven's mariculture leasing program. Small program, you can see a couple of sites over here in Bellport Bay, some over here as well in Mauritius Bay, and Brookhaven's town code that establishes its aquaculture leasing process does make mention of cultivation of aquatic plant life. So the seaweed culture permitting process would closely follow that of the process that is currently in place for shellfish farmers. As I mentioned, excuse me, access would be a prerequisite of an application submission that you have obtained or are in process of getting access to underwater land. And in addition to the permit applications you would be completing for DEC, you would also need to complete a joint permit application for the New York District of the Corps of Engineers and other involved New York State agencies, which would include New York State's Department of State, their coastal management program, and potentially your site may require private aid to navigation permits from the Coast Guard. So just like with shellfish, whether we're talking shellfish, seaweed, we would with your application, you would need to be submitting a cultivation plan, describing your gear, your deployment scheme, and your management and harvest activities. As many know, in New York and in the other states as well, the Corps of Engineers issued a nationwide permit number 55 for commercial seaweed, or maybe it's just seaweed mariculture activities, in March of last year. And so it would be a situation where we would be seeing that you had received your approvals from the other involved agencies, including Corps of Engineers, Department of State, Coast Guard, if necessary, and if your lease was in process, that it has been executed. Our permit fee for the culture permit is $100 annually, $100 fee. None of the others that I just mentioned have any fee associated with them. The time frame is variable. It's hard for us to say at DEC because our permit issuance is contingent on that of the other agencies, and potentially the owner of the underwater lands that is doing the leasing. So a typical range for oyster farms is 3 to 12 months. I would expect similar for seaweed cultivation or an oyster farmer who's amending their permit to add seaweed cultivation. And our permits are annual, expire on December 31st each year. We would not be involved in any post-harvest regulation of seaweed. That would fall to the State Department of Agriculture and Markets. So just to run down quickly what a permit that authorized seaweed or shellfish cultivation would look like. It's going to list your species, the boundaries of your underwater lands, identify the location, the specific culture activities you're authorized to undertake. And as they relate to seaweed cultivation, requirements would be perhaps depending on if the leasing authority had certain policies in place for your use of the underwater land, removal of seaweed in lines if you were growing a species like sugar kelp, which is of course a winter species, by a certain time in the spring, and there would be reporting requirements for the seeded lines you received in the fall and your annual yield in the spring, the following spring. So this is my contact information. We don't have anyone currently permitted to commercially produce seaweed. We do have 2 applications in process, and I'm sure that more will be forthcoming. But that does it for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Wade. Please remember to write your questions in the chat, please, and then we'll follow up with Wade at the end of this session's question and answer session. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker is Mike Ciaramella. Michael is the Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant and the Cornell Cooperative Extension. Mike works with the seafood and is now emerging seafood industry across New York, assisting producers in navigating the process and bringing foods to market through resource development, extension program, and technical trainings. And today, he will be talking about his work with seaweed.
Thank you guys for having me here and inviting me to speak today. As he said, my name is Mike Ciaramella. I'm the Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant, and I've been getting more involved in the seaweed space, specifically in the post-harvest sector, the processing and marketing, and getting that product to food markets. So I'm going to here today to talk to you a little bit about exploring seaweed production for both bioextraction as well as for food. And I'd like to start off by quickly revisiting the main issue that brings us here today, and that's eutrophication or excessive nutrients in our local waterways, which, as we know, can significantly and negatively impact the health of our local ecosystems. Eutrophication is caused by excessive nutrient inputs from a variety of sources, which can include excessive and improper fertilizer use, both through agriculture as well as home and garden care. Old and poorly maintained wastewater treatment plants, sewers, and septic systems, as well as various other land-based resources that are washed into waterways during storms and rainfall events through runoff. These excess nutrients in the water lead to the algal blooms, which you see here on the left. There's a picture of red tide that's happened in Peconic Estuary, as well as on the left, a brown tide that's been observed in the Great South Bay. You've already learned about many of the negative impacts of such blooms on our waterways, so I'll simply state that it's important to try and identify ways to reduce nutrient loads in the coastal waters to prevent excessive growth of microalgae. And one method that we do that is through bioextraction, or the biological removal of these excess nutrients from the waterways, typically done with our shellfish and macroalgal species, where the shellfish filter the water, consume those microalgae growing in it, and the macroalgae or the seaweeds remove the nutrients from the surrounding water for growth and reproduction, thus limiting the nutrients that are available for microalgal growth. When harvested from the water, the algae and nutrients consumed for growth and reproduction are then moved or extracted as well. But once removed, we then have to answer the question of now what do we do with it? Where do we go? We need to identify markets and uses for the shellfish and seaweeds that are being harvested for bioextraction. The focus of my talk today is really going to be on the seaweeds or the macroalgae like sugar kelp. And I'd like to start by taking a closer look at commercial seaweed production in the US. NOAA Sea Grant's National Seaweed Hubs developed and drafted a survey to assess the status of commercial seaweed production nationally, and they identified 12 states currently growing and harvesting seaweed products. They are growing them for a variety of uses, including food, personal care products, health supplements, and fertilizers. And it's important to note here that all of these uses have public health implications, as they are nearly all consumed directly or indirectly or applied to the skin. This means we need to look closer at the issue of public health and safety for consumption. So it's important when doing this to consider the sources of the nutrients that are causing eutrophication and explore whether or not there are more than just nutrients making their way into our local waterways through the pathways we mentioned earlier. When it comes to excess fertilizer use, likely not causing more than nutrient overload, but it could depend on the type and quality of the fertilizers that are being used. Sewage from old, poorly maintained, or damaged sewer and septic systems will have much more than just nutrient inputs making their way into the waterways. And runoff is not selectively carrying nutrients into the waterways. Therefore, there's potential for more than just nutrients polluting those water sources over time. Some of the other contaminants that could be entering the water through these avenues may include bacterial and viral pathogens that commonly reside in sewage and will be present throughout the natural environment and make their way into waterways during storm events through runoff. A variety of environmental chemicals like herbicides and pesticides used for agricultural production as well as home and garden care can also be carried into the waterways through runoff. And lastly, heavy metals can be similarly introduced from a variety of sources. This is important to take into consideration when we're determining what is going to be done with the seaweed we're actually harvesting. So the question is, can it actually be used for bioextraction as well as a food product? And the answer is yes, when done properly. So seaweed is going to naturally remove nutrients from waterways in order to grow, thus naturally afford that ecosystem the benefits of bioextraction once removed. There are, however, limitations to where seaweed meant for food can be grown. You must ensure that it's grown in open certified waters with low levels of contamination from pathogens and environmental chemicals. There are already a number of products on the market for seaweed, specifically kelp-based products, and the market does seem to be growing. However, this is largely occurring regionally. In general, it seems that value-added products are more palatable and thus more marketable in the US, and the greatest successes have been observed in the snack foods sector to date. One of the challenges of this, however, is that seaweed often represents a small portion of the product as a whole when used in these value-added production and snack foods. So it's unclear whether or not enough seaweed can actually be harvested for food and actually address the significant eutrophication issues that are challenging our local waterways. So what does this actually mean for New York and seaweed production in New York waters? I'd now like to explore some of the seaweed-centric efforts that are taking place in New York. And to start, in response to the increased interest in processing and marketing seaweed that we were getting in early 2021, New York Sea Grant started the Seaweed Processing and Marketing Task Force. This task force was comprised of industry, agency, academic, and NGO partners, all working in that seaweed space with an interest in advancing the industry as a whole. Through these efforts, we facilitated dialogue among the various participants to identify immediate challenges as well as potential solutions. These efforts specifically included first discussing industry challenges and identifying the needs to support the growing industry, identifying opportunities where we could actually support and assist, and then moving into the development of tools and resources. We then continue to evaluate and meet over time to evaluate the changing needs of this growing and emerging industry for New York State. The first challenge we really sought to address and identified was determining how seaweed was regulated in New York and the regulatory requirements for getting it to market. And this is specifically with regards to post-harvest processing and marketing of seaweeds. And through discussions through the task force, which comprised the various agencies involved in seaweed processing or to be involved in seaweed processing, we learned that seaweed was identified and categorized as a raw agricultural commodity and not considered a seafood product. And therefore, in its processed form, it was subject to the Food Safety and Modernization Act's preventive controls rule and not the Seafood HACCP regulation. However, looking closely at this rule that has been adopted by New York State, most producers are exempt as qualified facilities. So the exemption typically applies based on the size of the business. Because of all our producers are such small scale, they meet the definition of a qualified facility and thus are exempt from many aspects of the preventative controls rule. However, although exempt, they do still have to identify and control any hazards that are potentially associated with their product. So through these efforts, we identified an additional need to provide additional guidance for how you control potential hazards associated with your seafood and your seaweed products. And New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets has decided to require a scheduled process for any processed seaweed products and coming to market in New York State. So to assist the industry in understanding this regulatory framework that surrounds the seaweed production and processing for use as a food, we created a regulatory guide. In addition, a collection of supplementary topical resources were created to provide a more detailed information and overlook of some of the requirements and practices that the guide outlines. This will be reviewed shortly, but first I want to take a look at the regulatory guide itself. A regulatory guide was developed as an interactive PDF, which contains a regulatory flowchart to assist producers in understanding the complex regulatory framework surrounding the processing and marketing of seaweeds. And as users walk through the flowchart, they can click on the numbered boxes between each step to get additional details on the requirements for bringing seaweed from one step in the process to the next. This includes walking them through determining whether they are a qualified facility or not. And while this covers the current regulations surrounding the processing and marketing of seaweed for New York, it did not provide much detail on specifics of the requirements themselves, and as with all regulatory requirements, did not address quality. To address these additional industry needs, supplemental resources have been created. The first resource was meant to complement the guide and provides more detailed information on the Food Safety and Modernization Act's Preventive Controls Rule for Human Foods and the requirements therein. The two-page document includes a general overview of the rule requirements to help producers understand what compliance would entail. And although many of the producers in the US are currently small scale and meet the definition of a qualified facility, thus exempt from many aspects of this regulation, an understanding of these requirements is going to be important if they plan to expand their business and grow in the future. The second supplementary guide that was created was to familiarize the industry with best practices for harvesting and handling seaweed products to help ensure that high quality and safe production was taking place. This is critical for seaweeds intended for food markets and covers harvest, handling, temperature controls, stabilization, storage and transport, as well as sanitation and sanitary operations. Another challenge that the industry is actually another challenge the industry is facing is actually understanding the hazards that must be controlled for seaweeds and seaweed products. As I mentioned, they're still required to identify and control those hazards under the FSMA regulation, although exempt from the actual food safety plan requirements. The challenge here is that these hazards are poorly understood, and the information that does exist is still very unclear if it is transferable to different geographies and production methods, as well as different species. Though it is limited, there are some currently available resources as well as new initiatives taking place to address these issues. For instance, Connecticut Sea Grant has their Seaweeds Hazards Guide, which was developed to mimic that of the Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Control Guidance to outline and identify potential hazards associated with seaweed production for the state of Connecticut as known at the time of production. We also have new efforts through the Food and Drug Administration. The Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition has developed a work group that's starting to look into and explore the various different food safety hazards that have been associated with seaweed products to create additional guidance for the industry. And lastly, there are several research projects that are ongoing within the Northeast and beyond, including some I've been working with colleagues here right in New York to identify the various pathogens and food safety hazards and concerns that may be associated with our local seaweeds produced in Long Island waters or in and around Long Island. This information is really the foundation for controlling the food safety hazards and preventing illness in the future as we explore and expand the market for seaweed as a food. The next step in exploring this is the development of a seaweed food safety training program. So the resources that I just talked about, and as well as those that are coming down the line that are being developed and the research that is being conducted are great steps forward in helping us to understand the food safety hazards that are associated with seaweeds and ensuring that they can be safely grown and harvested for food. This information will set the foundation for the development of an effective food safety training. And I plan to continue to work with colleagues across the country to explore opportunities to develop a training program that will assist the industry in accessing the food market for seaweed products. So in summary, there are potential food markets for seaweed, but they are currently small and focused on value-added products, which typically only utilize small amounts of seaweed. So there is still some work to be done to identify and develop novel products that will utilize larger quantities. Production methods and practices must consider the intended market, and seaweeds intended for consumption must be grown, harvested, and handled in a way that ensures quality and safety. It'll also be important to develop a well-planned marketing strategy to continue to grow the market for seaweed-based products and ensure that seaweed food production can effectively address the environmental issues necessary through bioextraction. You also want to be careful when it comes to marketing a product as delicious and nutritious and as a solution to pollution. Producers will want to be prepared to effectively educate consumers on how something can effectively clean polluted waterways and still be safe for consumption. This holds true for both shellfish and seaweeds. Overall, we're expanding our knowledge of seaweed production and safety, but continued growth in the seaweed safety sector will be important to ensure that seaweed can be commercially harvested and processed safely for consumption. Lastly, we continue to work towards the development of resources to assist the industry in understanding and accessing food markets for seaweed. So that's all I had to share with you guys today. If you have any questions, I'll answer those during the Q&A session, but feel free to take my contact information, reach out with any questions in the future. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak today.
Awesome. Great talk, Michael. Thank you again. Moving on to our last speaker for this particular session is Anoushka Concepcion. Anoushka is an associate extension educator in marine aquaculture for the Connecticut Sea Grant and UConn's Cooperative Extension. She conducts one-on-one consultations with prospective aquaculture producers, conducts research to address emerging stakeholder needs, organizes workshops for industry and general audiences, and presents at various research conferences. Today, she will be talking about the Connecticut perspectives on seaweed aquaculture, as Connecticut has existing regulations for growing seaweed. Anoushka, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. This presentation was put together in conjunction with the Connecticut Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Aquaculture. So while I'm not the regulatory authority, I'm Sea Grant. The presentation was vetted by the Bureau of Aquaculture folks. So any specific questions related to regulations, I would say you would have to direct it to them. So an overview of Connecticut's industry. Okay, all right. So just to give you an overview of what aquaculture is in Connecticut. Aquaculture, well, we don't really have a wild capture fishery, not any longer, not since the crash of the lobster industry in the 90s. So pretty much our seafood production is cultivated by what's considered aquaculture or cultivation. All of our aquaculture, again, goes towards food. So bioextraction is something that's really not at the forefront yet in Connecticut. But we do have a long history with cultivating our seafood in our waterways. Many of these farms, or I should take a step back and say, the aquaculture in Connecticut is comprised of mostly shellfish, so bivalve muskin shellfish, clams, and oysters. We have both extensive aquaculture, so on bottom, and also intensive aquaculture, which is in some sort of containment system. We have some finfish production. We have a very large land-based recirculating farm that cultivates branzino, and then, which is a type of finfish. And then we also have some seaweed farms. So again, aquaculture is very much a part of our maritime heritage and our cultural seafood production in the state of Connecticut. We have more than 70,000 acres of underwater grounds that are deemed specifically for commercial cultivation. So that doesn't really include recreation or restoration, but just commercial cultivation alone. Many of these grounds have been active for over 100 years. And some of these families and sites go back to the King's Grant. So it's very much, again, part of Connecticut's agricultural history. Our industry is valued at more than $30 million and growing. And again, that's just the commercial, not including recreational, but aquaculture employs more than, or provides more than 300 jobs. Majority of our operations are small scale, family-owned operations. And just to give you an idea of just the 2019 data that was reported, our oysters were valued at more than $16 million, clams valued at more than $7 million. So I'm not really going to go into the details like Wade did in terms of permitting for seaweed farms and permitting of aquaculture in the state of Connecticut. We do have a very comprehensive guidance document available. It's available on Connecticut Sea Grant's website, as well as the Bureau of Aquaculture's website, I'll show you an image of it in a little bit, but just really the general information about permitting for seaweed farms in Connecticut. The lead regulatory agency where applications start, the first step is the Connecticut Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Aquaculture. They're the first step and the last step in the process for all seaweed applicants, really all aquaculture applicants. Because shellfish pretty much dominates our seafood production, our entire aquaculture system, that's open water coastal aquaculture, is based on the shellfish model. So what that means for seaweed, specifically sugar kelp, seaweed can only be cultivated in what's considered approved or conditionally approved areas. So that does restrict right now where seaweed farms can be placed. Because we do have this again, comprehensive, lengthy leasing system. For folks that just wanted to cultivate kelp, we were able to provide, through a lot of work, a lot of partners in Connecticut, a kelp-only license option was passed in the state legislature quite a few years ago, allowing farmers just to investigate cultivation of kelp. And that is done in state waters. These licenses are good for 5 years, which then can be renewed for an additional 5 years. So the typical size of our farms are relatively small, anywhere from 2 to 9 acres. However, keep in mind that not all aquaculture or not all seaweed farms are producing or utilizing at capacity. So most aquaculture farms in Connecticut are only cultivating at, using 1 to 3 long lines at most. So we don't have, I should say we have 2 separate types of aquaculture permits. One is an aquaculture certificate. That certificate is issued to applicants or farmers to be able to deploy gear and to grow kelp. Once applicants secure permits through Army Corps and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, they can then be issued the formal aquaculture certificate, which means they're good to go to deploy lines. But in order to sell their kelp, that's different. Then they need to apply for a seaweed producer license. And the producer license enables farmers to sell their kelp specifically for human consumption. The steps to get to that point would be farmers would need to submit samples 6 to 8 weeks prior to the first harvest, commercial harvest, or I should say sellable harvest, in order to be tested for pathogens and chemicals such as heavy metals. And so this is a process that's been happening since 2012. And every year, again, in order for, so essentially the seaweed producer license replicates the shellfish shippers tag that our shellfish industry members have. Just to give you an idea about the number of farms and the volume of landings, since 2001, when the first seaweed farm was deployed, the first seaweed farm in the state of Connecticut was, or still is, you could say it's active, although they didn't deploy lines this year, was at the Bridgeport Aquaculture High School. So they are technically the first farm in the state of Connecticut. But since then, a total of 16, including the Bridgeport Aquaculture High School's farm, have been, or aquaculture certificates have been issued. But given that number, only 4 farms this past season deployed gear, but only 3 of those farms were able to harvest any sort of product. That's for a number of reasons. So there is that big discrepancy between 16 potential farms, but only 4 active farms this season. We do have an commercially approved nursery in the state of Connecticut. That is Green Waves facility. And that is where all applicants or all farmers are encouraged to get their seed from. Landings may not be as much as what you think that landings are in Maine. It was reported to be approximately 500 pounds in 2020. While the state of Connecticut doesn't require landings to be reported, they do send out an annual production survey so that they can capture specific information. So with that said, not everyone has reported in 2020, still waiting for information from 2021 and certainly waiting for information this year, but our harvest season is not over yet. So stay tuned. We have 2 species of seaweeds, of macroalgae, that are approved for production in the state of Connecticut. The first is sugar kelp, and the second is Gracilaria tikvahe. The Gracilaria is only approved for tank-based cultivation. There are many reasons for that. There's an image of Gracilaria in the left. Because it's a summer species, not only are there user conflict issues, so permitting becomes a challenge, but also everything likes to settle on the Gracilaria. It has a very high surface area. And so you can see that there's a mussel and all sorts of sponge and other critters that are living in the Gracilaria. So in terms of product quality, not really appropriate for human consumption. And just to note that while a lot of folks think of Maine and what's happening in Maine, Maine has a very large and well-established wild harvest, commercial wild harvest industry. The state of Connecticut does not. So everything we do is pretty much considered aquaculture. So again, seafood production is really the primary focus and the priority in the state of Connecticut because it generates the highest value for that type of commodity as opposed to any sort of non-food commodity. So in the state of Connecticut, seaweed, as Mike mentioned in his presentation, is considered a raw agricultural commodity, and therefore it is sold as such, as well as food safety comes into play, and everything sold in Connecticut falls under some sort of food safety plan. So an example of how farmers in Connecticut are selling their seaweed, it's mostly in its fresh, raw form, direct sale to restaurants. There's some small scale drying being conducted, but again, that's very small scale. So we do have a short growing season. And so right now our 2 seaweed farmers are constantly going out, harvesting from their lines and making deliveries as we speak. For any sort of value-added production or food value-added production, there is some going on, again, very small scale, mostly investigative, mostly with kelp noodles or blanching kelp. We do have the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection Food and Standards Division that provides guidance to any sort of producer or any processor that would like to process or create a value-added product for kelp. There is some market for fertilizer, but that's mostly towards the end of the season. Connecticut farmers really want to focus on the high value, high quality seaweed that they're producing because it is at a cost that they're producing the seaweed. And so fertilizers sort of sold off end of the season when the tips sort of blanch and kind of break away and get brittle. So that's kind of how they're trying to incorporate both food production as well as non-food commodity for utilizing seaweed. So these are just some of the resources that have been available for all aquaculture producers in the state of Connecticut. I mentioned the permitting guide. It is again, well-established guide. It's very comprehensive, but this is a guide that's written by all participating regulatory agencies in the state of Connecticut. And so that's, again, available on our website, and more detailed information on agencies, the process, jurisdiction, cost of the different aspects are included in that guide. We also have the Connecticut Aquaculture Mapping Atlas. This was established in 2007. I know that there are other mapping tools out there, but really in the state of Connecticut, this is the only mapping tool that is approved for use when farmers are siting or trying to find sites for their farms. And of course, this tool, the mapping tool, it works hand in hand with the aquaculture application. Other resources supporting the development of kelp aquaculture in Connecticut include, as Mike mentioned, this is a snapshot of the cover of our seaweed production and processing guide in the state of Connecticut. In the state of Connecticut, all aquaculture producers have to operate under some sort of HACCP plan. The challenge with HACCP for seaweed is, as Mike said, it doesn't fall under seafood. It's not really a produce. So what does that mean? We now know it's a raw agricultural commodity. When we first developed this guide, FDA did not make that designation. We just sort of rolled with it and said, let's consider it a raw agricultural commodity. So we're happy that FDA agrees. So yes, we did something right. But really, this is the guide that all seaweed producers in the state of Connecticut operate under. Every HACCP plan is different. You can't apply one HACCP plan to another operation. And so once farmers take the seafood HACCP course, they learn how to use this guide. And so it's a really great resource. We also, Connecticut Sea Grant also holds an annual Connecticut Seaweed Stakeholder Workshop every year. Anyone that's associated with seaweed in the state of Connecticut usually comes to this meeting. We talk about issues and try and figure out what the needs are and how we can all work together to address them. There's also the National Sea Grant Seaweed Hub that some Connecticut stakeholders have or participate in. There's also the newly formed Sugar Kelp Cooperative that assists farmers in their network to find ways to make selling their product more efficient. And of course, there's also nonprofits like Green Wave that provide assistance to their farmers in training. So those are just some of the resources available to Connecticut producers. So this is an emerging industry. It's new. It's not where shellfish is. Actually, seaweed is kind of where shellfish was 40 years ago. So, we still have a ways to go. But really, some of the primary challenges and barriers to expansion, and this can be applied to any bioextraction or uses for bioextraction, it's really the post-harvest processing infrastructure. Again, in Connecticut, our industry or our seafood production infrastructure is designed around shellfish. And so we're really not processing shellfish and making value-added commodities with shellfish. So really safe storage, long-term storage and processing infrastructure is very limited, or processing facilities are limited. Considering that seaweed, sugar kelp is a very short growing or harvest season and an even very short shelf life, this is something that's presenting much more of a challenge for folks. Also, consistent large-scale market outlets. Our Connecticut farmers are selling their seaweed. They're working really hard to establish consistent market outlets year after year. But again, it's a very short shelf life that they're finding that they have to address. But their focus is focusing on the fresh product where they can generate really high value for their crop. Another challenge, which contributes to that disparity between the 16 aquaculture certificates that have been issued, but only the 4 farms that were able to deploy gear, comes down to availability of seed. And that's been the challenge for a lot of farmers in the state of Connecticut, is where to find seed. Many farmers haven't even deployed gear at all for the past few years because they just don't have access to seed. And so again, we talk about challenges and barriers, but these all present really good opportunities for folks to try and address so that we can increase seaweed cultivation in the state of Connecticut. And that's really all I have. Thank you very much.
All right, Anoushka, thank you for that great talk. You mentioned a number of resources at the end of your talk, and please feel free, as well as for Wade and Mike, to drop those into the chat as well. I want to make sure we take advantage of having this time and having everyone together and sharing those resources around. So that concludes our first session. So right now, I want to thank everybody that gave a talk, Anoushka, Wade, and Michael. And so we'll have about 20 minutes now for any follow-up questions. And again, please feel free to add the questions you have into the chat. And if you have any questions directed at any of our specific speakers, let's move forward with that. And I'd like to invite, if they're comfortable to do so, Wade, Michael, Anoushka, you can keep your mics on, your cameras on if you'd like, and we'll start the discussion. Take a minute, catch your breath, maybe get up and stretch. I'm going to go through the chat again and just kind of start paring down some of these questions. One first question that I had that was added into the chat to begin with was from Bob, and he asked any K through 12 administrators or teachers just to identify themselves in the chat and start a little a discussion there. So if there's anybody there, feel free to raise your hand or make yourself known in the chat. All right. Let's see. The first question came up during your talk, Wade, from David Berg, and mentioned that there have been a couple seaweed permit applications submitted earlier this year. Can those applicants expect to receive their permits by the next season, say November?
Yes, I would hope so. Again, as I mentioned in the talk, the way that the law is written for DEC's on-off bottom culture permit is that the applicant has to demonstrate they've gotten any other federal or state permits or approvals that are required. So we would need to see those approvals prior to issuing our own permit.
Great. Thanks, Wade. The next question is also from David Berg, and it's as follows. Is there any effort underway to change the TMAUA to more of a lease or license program, and one that includes seaweed and perhaps fish as well?
I am not aware of any. If I have had one person reach out that had interest in establishing a kelp-only farm in state waters, and I explained the situation that we don't have a program like a state leasing program to provide access for kelp or seaweed, and that their best bet would to be using our shellfish cultivation permit application as a template to create a a proposal and describe the location where they were interested in establishing their farm, lat long coordinates, acreage, etc. And then I could take that, we could review it for completeness, and then we could interact with our agency's counsel's office to see how we might move forward. Because again, the state currently does not have the ability to lease underwater lands for anything other than shellfish cultivation, and an actual leasing program, anything akin to say like that Suffolk County established for Peconic and Gardner's Bays has never been done. So none of those administrative policies or regulations that would go along with such a program have ever been undertaken.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wade. I'll take you off the hot seat now, and I'll pose the next question to Michael and Anoushka. If seaweed grown outside of certified waters were able to be to meet all the testing standards that are set for food products, what might be other barriers that might prevent its use for food?
So I can start there. I mean, one, you have to get and ensure that the agencies would accept that and allow for that. I mean, there would need to be significant scientific evidence and backing that the seaweeds being produced in those uncertified waters, which are deemed unsafe for shellfish, are actually safe for the harvest of seaweeds. So one, you would need a significant amount of data to show that that is actually still a safe product. Likely you would be required to do quite a bit of testing on every batch coming out of the water if it's going to be coming from uncertified waters to ensure that it meets all of those standards. But then there's also the added complexities of now you're trying to market a product as safe to eat coming from waters that everyone says are unsafe to eat from. It may need or require recertification of water bodies specifically for kelp production. There's certified open bodies of water for oyster and shellfish production, and then there may be different certified bodies and different standards for those associated with kelp, because they do essentially operate and grow differently. They're not filter feeding, they're extracting the nutrients. So there could be those, and does the agency have the capacity to address that and create those second set of standards? I don't know if Anoushka, you had anything you wanted to add?
No, that pretty much sums it up. A similar case in the state of Connecticut. However, it's also one of those challenges of we're struggling to find markets and outlets for all the kelp we're producing anyway. And we're still not cultivating at capacity. And so I think it's important to try and address the long-term market situation before we start, and again, this is just the Connecticut perspective, because this is what we hear from farmers in Connecticut and regulatory agencies in Connecticut is all the product we're growing is still not completely gone at the end of the season. And so until we get to that point, opening up potential, trying to address additional barriers,
Sure.
excuse me, just because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I get it. So addressing first things first. All right. All right. Thank you for those answers, by the way. I think very informative. All right, let me go through the chat one more. So this might be a follow-up. I might have touched upon some of this. So again, Anoushka and Mike, what might be some of the complexities for marketing and gaining public acceptance of seaweeds, even for non-food products? And you can compare this with either in the currently grown waters, or even if we want to take the jump into those impaired water bodies again.
I think the big thing there is education and making sure that everybody really truly understands how those kelps and seaweeds are cleaning the water, right? And they're cleaning the water not by taking out pathogens and harmful chemicals and toxins and pollutants, but by taking out excessive nutrients, but also making it very clear that they're not taking out all those other pathogens and harmful chemicals and nutrients. And that requires the data and the science to back it, to show that it's not actually a health hazard or a health risk. And with all that information, then making sure that the consumers are aware of it, which is a major challenge, especially for us here in the state of New York. Who's going to do it? Is the small industry big enough to really educate the consumer population in the state of New York, and let alone the Northeast and the nation? And I would say at the moment, there's plenty of opportunity to grow in certified waters. So I don't know if that's a challenge that really the small industry wants to address at the moment. But I mean, that could be wrong. But I would say that the challenges are very similar from the other question. It's just making sure the education is clear and that the science is there to back that it is actually a safe product coming out of uncertified waters, if that would be allowable by the agencies.
And just to add to what Mike said, in Connecticut, we have that seaweed producer license. And so that's provided to the farmers by the state. And so it's essentially their way of saying, I have this license, the state tested it, my seaweed is top notch. And then that way they can focus on the nutritional benefits of the seaweed that they're producing. So again, but the state of Connecticut has made a commitment to ensure that because all farmers have to operate under a HACCP plan, the state's job then is to enforce that and to conduct the inspection, and part of that is doing the testing to issue the seaweed producer license.
I would also add in there, I'm speaking from the food perspective because that's my area, that's my expertise. When it comes to all the other uses, which I already mentioned, most of them are still potentially public health issues. Even if you're using it as a biostimulant and putting it on the fields, what are you introducing into that soil that's also could potentially be taking up into the crops that you're doing? Just because it's unsafe for food doesn't mean, oh, just throw it in the fields and it'll be a crop, or put it in some makeup because that's going on your face. What heavy metals, what other things and pollutants are in there that can be absorbed through the skin? There's a lot more information that needs to be known before you can actually go and utilize these products in any use that's going to have some form of public health implications. And right now, that's most of the uses for seaweed.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for those perspectives. And I feel very lucky having both New York and Connecticut quite literally right next to each other right now. So thank you. Anoushka, I want to sort of bore down on one point you made during your talk with a question from Stephen. He says, Anoushka, with potential demand, 16 permitted growers, but an apparent lack of seed availability this year, is the permitting process for nurseries prohibitive? The culture of seed strings is a process that has minimal equipment needs and is accessible by people of all levels of training.
Right. No, there's no any, prohibitive process to establish a seaweed nursery. Some of the challenges that I've been told by farmers is space and infrastructure and the cost of renting out a room and the cost of electricity and things like that. It's something that while they're so focused on selling their product, the last thing they want to do is put in additional investment into setting up a nursery. But you're absolutely right. It can be done in your garage too. You're right. But folks have tried it as well, doing a very simple, you have a very simple setup. They just haven't been as successful. And maybe it's, I can only speak for again, from what some of these individuals have told me. They didn't realize how difficult it was going to be. And I think potentially, I keep telling them, you're not going to get it right the first time. You have to keep doing it year after year. Another challenge we found is finding seed. And finding seed, I remember Long Island Sound is the southernmost growing range for sugar kelp. So it's just one of those things where, you have to go out, you have to know where to source. But, I think that as folks realize that the interest is growing, I'm hopeful that there's a lot of great resources out there that show folks how to set up a nursery. I'm just hoping that they'll utilize it.
Yeah, and any way that we can, while we're doing the symposium and even in the follow-up, I really hope to receive at least 20, 30 emails from all of you, all the presenters saying, hey, this is what we have, let's connect and get this, so it's not just a symposium. This is, get people excited about it. All right, before I talk too much, let me go through the chat again and maybe take Anoushka and Mike off of the hot seat for just a moment, so bear with me. We have, oh man, there's quite a bit. For Wade, I have a question from David Berg asking, has ACOE expressed any concerns over the seaweed permit applications, or are they expected to require any additional information? If you're still,
I have not been contacted, by their office with any additional questions, and in neither of our applicants have reached out to me or any other staff in our unit and with any information. So I don't know.
okay, yeah, that's more than all right. Wade, while I have you again on the hot seat, I had another question come in through a direct message asking, have any shellfish growers reached out about seaweed in your permitting areas?
So we just have the two applicants. They are both in the town of Brookhaven's licensing program. Once the Corps of Engineers had issued their nationwide permit in spring of 2021, a couple of months after that, I sent out a email to growers in those two town programs because they wouldn't have had the complications that Suffolk County and state waters had, and just gave them some guidance on if this was something they were interested in pursuing and amending their oyster farming permit, their off-bottom culture permit, to include kelp cultivation, that a process by which to do that. And so the two applicants in Brookhaven's program are the only applications we've received today.
Okay, great, thank you. I think it's time for a break. I want to thank Michael, Anoushka, and Wade again for session 3. Let's take a 20-minute break, and we'll reconvene at 2:40, and then we'll begin session 4 then. So get up, get some coffee, maybe go snack on some seaweed snacks, but we'll see you again in 20 minutes. Thank you so much.